It is a true pleasure to have you with us today at this event. And you can see behind me the results of many people's efforts that have gone into making this observatory a reality. I would like to at least mention a few people and organizations who have contributed substantially to the successful venture that you see. Eck Associates, the architects who helped design this building, and in particular Dave Matheson, Rick's construction company, who we worked with to build the facility, our physical plant department, who helped in overseeing that construction and have helped us with many other aspects of the facility. The strong support from the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who helped us to acquire the funds that we needed in order to build this facility. To Charla and Hal McAllister, to all of their efforts, their hard work in bringing the 16-inch telescope to Georgia State University, and in their subsequent efforts to help with the overall contributions that you see inside the observatory. To all of the Department of Physics and Astronomy faculty, staff, and students who have spent many, many hours in helping us with many aspects of this facility, and to Agnes Scott College for their cooperation and efforts in agreeing to move their 30-inch telescope from the location in Decatur to the present location that you now see that telescope. So, without going into naming many people, and I hope no one feels overlooked or slighted, I would like to now present the first person on our program, which is Dr. Harlan A. McAllister. Hal McAllister received his undergraduate degree at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, went on to do his doctoral work at University of Virginia, served as a postdoctoral fellow at Kitt Peak National Observatory, Tucson, Arizona, and came to Georgia State in 1977. Hal has made an outstanding contribution to our program since he joined us in '77. He is the director of the Center for High Angular Resolution Astronomy, CHARA, who is right at the forefront of the cutting edge of astronomy and high angular resolution work. I present to you Hal McAllister.
Thanks very much, Dick. It's hard to get up in those chairs when you lean back like that. Welcome to the beautiful Southland and the dogwoods and the pines. I'm supposed to just say a few words about the 16-inch, but let me give a little bit more background as well about this event. When I first suggested that we get together and dedicate the observatory as a part of the inauguration process for President Palms, I thought it was especially fitting to rededicate one of the world's most scientifically productive telescopes, which is the little 16-inch sitting behind us, behind me back here, at the same time as we reaffirm and rededicate our university through the installation of our new president. And Dr. Palms, we're especially delighted to have you with us this afternoon. Also, we're very fortunate on this occasion to have with us as our speaker, who will be separately introduced, a person who challenges us to make well of this observatory because he's built himself one of the most productive and best observatories and departments of astronomy in the world, Dr. Harlan Smith, and we look forward to hearing your words. The 16-inch, which is mounted in the small dome back behind me, was one of the first telescopes installed at the new National Observatory in southern Arizona, which was created in the late 1950s as an effort to provide astronomers, Joe astronomer at any university like me, for example, with access to forefront instrumentation and telescopes to do internationally competitive astronomy. National laboratories exist in many fields in science and as well as in astronomy, of course. The 16-inch was brought to Kitt Peak, which is about 40 miles to the west of Tucson, and installed in November 1963, and opened its doors, or its domes, I guess I should say, at about that time. And for 25 years served as a highly productive instrument. Many of us in the audience here have used the 16-inch in its former surroundings. Many of us would not have gotten our PhD theses if the 16-inch had not performed so nobly over those years. Unfortunately, the realities of life necessitated Kitt Peak closing the telescope at a time when they were trying to redirect resources to building larger and larger telescopes, which in the heart of every astronomer we like to do. The telescope was shut down in about 1984, briefly reopened in 1985, and then late in 1985 it was put up for grabs on a competitive basis within the U.S., and some 24 institutions submitted proposals to the National Science Foundation to gain access to the telescope, and ours was the successful proposal, which I'm delighted to say. The telescope has been referenced in a paper by Helmut Abt, who's the editor of the Astrophysical Journal, as probably producing more papers per clear night than any other telescope on Kitt Peak, including the 4-meter telescope. So this is a hard-working little instrument back here behind us. It's a real challenge for us to do something equally significant in the future. The group with which we competed included institutions from the American Southwest, which has far clearer skies, drier skies, and I would like to point out that I think it's an attribute, hopefully, to their regard for our own program, that they took a chance and let us put it here in the damper climate of Georgia, and I'm sure we'll live up to their expectations. When we heard that we were going to be getting the telescope, I and my colleagues had already been selecting the site and planning the building, and I well remember walking through these woods here when they were as dense as the woods out there, trying to envision what it would be like having an observatory and a telescope here. And I didn't envision this. This is actually far nicer than I thought. And as Dean Faulkner often points out to me, I first missed the cost estimate for the observatory by a factor of 2. And I like to reply that, well, I'm an astronomer, and that's good enough for most astronomical accuracy. The university came through with money, obviously, and so here we are today. I'd also like to point out that to some extent we're already beginning to pay back the university. We have just 2 weeks ago received word from the National Science Foundation that a project headed by Dr. Bill Bagnolo with his collaborators Ingemar Furenlid and Doug Geis has been funded to build on the grounds here what will become the largest effective telescope in the southeast. And it's a novel telescope, a multi-telescope telescope. And I invite you to look at an exhibit we've set up inside one of our propaganda rooms in the building to learn more about the MTT. The transfer of the 16-inch from Kitt Peak to Georgia was the effort of a number of people, and I may be duplicating Dick here, but I have to in thanking some people. Dan Witt and John Wilson were responsible for escorting this thing in a rental truck cross country, seeing it safely through a number of states to get here to its new home, and so we thank them especially for their efforts. Once it arrived, many of us were involved in installing it and sprucing it up. My graduate students, Don Berry, Ween Say, and Ed Dombrowski, particularly put in a lot into the mechanical aspects of the telescope, and my colleague Bill Hartkoff and I had the pleasure of giving it a new paint job. Charles Hopper, the departmental electronics technician, has been a wonderful aid in troubleshooting many of the electromechanical problems that we've encountered with it, and it works beautifully. Although the 16-inch is not the biggest telescope at the observatory here or in the state, it is possibly the best in this area of the country because of its superb optical quality. You can mount a human being on the back end of it and point them around the sky if you so wanted. It'll hold a lot of equipment. And we have already produced our first undergraduate senior thesis using the telescope, so stay tuned. As we look forward to giving this venerable telescope a new career in Georgia, we hope that our skies will be clear, as astronomers like to say often. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hal. I would next like to introduce Dr. Alberto Sadoun, who is the director of the Bradley Observatory at Agnes Scott College. Dr. Sadoun received his undergraduate degree at MIT and his doctorate degree there as well. He has been at Agnes Scott for the last 6 years, I believe, and has served as director for the observatory for that time. He has also served as a summer faculty appointee at NASA out at JPL for the last 2 summers. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alberto Sadoun from Agnes Scott College.
Thank you very much. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored guests, what a pleasure it is to be here at the dedication of Hard Labor Creek Observatory. After years of careful planning and preparation, Agnes Scott College is very proud to present to you the the fully refurbished 30-inch Beck telescope. This telescope, in such a prime observing site, will rival all others in the East. Its establishment in such an ideal setting represents the friendly cooperation between the two institutions that will share the facilities at this observatory, Agnes Scott College and Georgia State University. I'm here on this auspicious occasion to relate to you the history of Agnes Scott's 30-inch telescope. It is a most fitting occasion to do so because it has been 40 years, almost to the day, since the telescope was obtained and was housed at Bradley Observatory on the Agnes Scott campus. This telescope was built in 1930 and was owned by a wealthy amateur astronomer, Mr. Gibson of Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. 19 years later, in 1949, Mr. Gibson put the 4-ton telescope up for auction to the highest bidder. The only two parties interested were Agnes Scott and the Soviet Union. Naturally, the Soviet Union was in a better position to offer more money, so in fact, she was awarded the sale. But as you may recall, the year 1949 was a very difficult one as foreign affairs go, much to the benefit of Agnes Scott, as it turned out. That year, with the partitioning of Germany and the Berlin airlift taking place, the Cold War between East and West began. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly soured, and the Soviet Union was denied an export license. So, Agnes Scott College became the only party interested in buying that telescope and was given the sale for the very paltry sum of $15,000. Many people were to be thanked for this project. The Beck Foundation of Atlanta put up the money for the telescope itself. An additional $50,000 came from the Bradley Foundation of Columbus, Georgia, for housing it and for the major refurbishments and modifications necessary to accommodate it to our latitude. The Research Corporation of New York supplied $3,100 for instrumentation, and Mandel Zabin, the philanthropist from Atlanta, contributed $1,000 towards the creation of the planetarium in Bradley Observatory. It's a pleasure to acknowledge the great amount of time, effort, and initiative that Bill Calder, former director of Bradley Observatory at Agnes Scott College, put into this endeavor. It was his project, and he did everything from trudging through the snows of Pennsylvania to examine the telescope, to its refurbishment, for getting it prepared for Agnes Scott. I should also not fail to mention that it was the vision and dedication of Dr. James R. McCain, president of Agnes Scott at the time, that made it all possible. The dedication took place June 3rd, 1950. Thousands of students and visitors have had their lives enriched by this telescope, and for 40 years it has stood as a premier instrument in this part of the country. In the early 1970s, it was once again modernized and continued to be used effectively by students, faculty, and the general public. By this time, the city of Atlanta had begun to grow, and unfortunately, the impact of light pollution at Agnes Scott had started to become a serious threat to the telescope's effectiveness. The rest is history. The light pollution eventually became overwhelming, and something had to be done. After much consideration, the decision was made to relocate the telescope. After further extensive refurbishment, and with the cooperation of Georgia State University, for which we are grateful, we have completed its move to the new Hard Labor Creek Observatory. We hope to continue state-of-the-art improvements and to make this a most impressive and enviable instrument in the East. I would like to thank President Ruth Schmidt for her vision to pursue this dream, and Ellen Hall, formerly Dean of the College, for her unfailing support and interest. I would also like to thank two colleagues for all their long hours and expertise devoted to making this project a success. Professor Art Bowling, Chairman of the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and Mr. Bill Washburn of Academic Computing, also an avid amateur astronomer. How ironic, yet how fitting that this year, 40 years after Agnes Scott happened to benefit from the rising tensions between the great powers, we enter a new era of lessening of tensions between East and West. So it is appropriate that in this new age of peace, and as Germany becomes united and democratization is spreading in Eastern Europe, we dedicate this observatory to the pursuit of knowledge and towards the education and inspiration of students and of the general public as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our new president of Georgia State University, Dr. John Palms. Dr. Palms was born in the Netherlands. He and his family settled in this country about 16 years later in Clearwater, Florida. He then pursued his bachelor's degree at the Citadel, receiving his degree in physics in 1958. He served 4 years in the Air Force, teaching a year at physics at the Air Force Academy. He received his master's degree in physics from Emory in 1959, and then he went to the University of New Mexico, where he received his PhD in 1966, completing his dissertation at Los Alamos National Labs. He returned to join the faculty at Emory in 1966, and then became chairman of the department in physics in '69. In 1974, he was named Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Emory, became Vice President for Arts and Sciences in 1979, and then was named Vice President for Academic Affairs at Emory in 1982. Dr. Palms is a member of numerous honor organizations and has received the Thomas Jefferson Award for Leadership from Emory, the highest award for leadership that Emory grants. It is my pleasure to introduce to you John Palms.
I want to tell you what a sense of pride I feel today to be here at this observatory. Right after I was named, I got a call from a professor at Georgia State University named Dick Miller, and he said, I want to drive you out to Hard Labor Creek Park. And I said, what for? He said, we got an observatory there I want you to see. And so early one morning, I guess about 7 o'clock in the morning, we drove out here, about last year at this time, and the concrete slab was just put down. And I heard about the intentions of getting the telescope here. Astronomy has been an important part of university life through the ages. If you go throughout Europe and many of the liberal arts colleges in the United States, you'll see a little dome at the most liberal arts of liberal arts colleges. And it was a traditional way by which most students satisfy their science requirements. You can teach a lot of physics by teaching astronomy. You can teach mechanics, you can teach thermodynamics, you can teach optics, you can teach energy, you can teach nuclear physics, and before you know it, students don't even know they're learning physics, right? When I tell people that Georgia State University has a first-class astronomy group, people just don't believe it. You know, this is an urban community university. You're not supposed to have things like that. When they find out that 400 and 500 students take astronomy every quarter, or every 2 quarters or so, they can't believe it either. And when I tell them that we're just putting in a joint proposal with Georgia Tech for a $10 million project to build a multiple array telescope for binary star observation, they certainly can't believe it. When I tell them they're going to have to raise $5 million, they're in awe. But I can't think of a better way for a new president to spend his time than having the university receive that grant and going out and challenge the community to get that kind of support for first-class work. It's been an interesting week. This is inauguration week, and started out yesterday, Monday morning, listening to a superb lecture on the Englishness of the English Renaissance, and ended up today with listening to people who are trying to teach adults how to read the adult literacy program. And this is the breadth of diversity that exists in this marvelous university. Remedial programs for people who may have not had the benefit of elementary and secondary education, and the most sophisticated PhD programs in astronomy and astrophysics. And that's what a modern, metropolitan, comprehensive university is supposed to be all about. I do want to take the opportunity to thank those at Georgia State in the administration and liberal arts colleges, the deans, and I want to say chairman of the Department of Physics. I think Joe Hadley's been chairman ever since the department almost got started, for their dedication to excellence and their support for developing such a first-class program, and all those involved. It is a real sense of pride that I have as I discover this. I know you're dying to hear our visiting professor, our distinguished speaker today. And Professor Harlan Smith is indeed preeminent in the field of astronomy. There are not many people working in astronomy in the world that has not heard of his name. His degree is from Harvard. He taught at Yale for 10 years, and he's been at Texas, I guess, for over 25 years. He's the head of the McDonald Observatory there. He believes in physics and astronomy and astrophysics. We were just talking a little while ago about what disciplines undergraduates should take that give them the best opportunity to get into various professional schools, including law. And some studies have been done, and if you want to get into law school, the best subject you can major in is physics, believe it or not. And so frequently that begins with astronomy. So we're delighted that Professor Smith took time to be with us today, and I'm looking forward to his comments. Again, I hope that you'll have time this week to take in some of the activities associated with really showing the world that Georgia State University is on the way to really being first class. The inauguration is something like a wedding, you know. It's the sort of the formal tying of the knot. I'm still on probation until Friday. You can still get up and be opposed to this. But it's going to be a wonderful event. We have almost 300 people coming from representing colleges and universities throughout the United States and other parts of the world. And if you're around, please, you're welcome to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Palms and Director Miller and lots of other people here I see who I think deserve a proper title. I think that, you know, a philosopher, if you go back to the roots, is a lover of wisdom. But I think virtually everyone here should be called a philastropher, lover of the stars. And that's a word that occurred to me some years ago and I think really deserves to get into the English language. So please spread it. You don't even have to give credit where you heard it. Anytime, anyone you see who's a lover of the stars, you've got another philastropher. And I think if you scratch most people in the world, you'll find they're philosophers at heart. Okay? Oh, there's so many things I'd like to talk about. And in particular, where to begin? For example, President Palms confessed, or I guess it was introduced, that he came from Holland. I'll bet very few people here know what the principal export to the world is from Holland. Most people say tulips. Forget it. It's astronomers and lovers, philosophers. There was a time, I think 15 or 20 years ago, when I would bet a third of the major observatories in the world had Dutch astronomers at their head. And there's still a very significant contingent. Such a tiny country, so absolutely preeminent in astronomy. And some of that must have rubbed off on even a physicist here, so to give the kind of support that we're getting apparently at Georgia Tech, or about to get at Georgia State. So anyway, welcome to the crowd. You come from a wonderful background. And then also there was a remark about the Soviet Union here, and I had a couple of occasions to go to the Soviet Union and didn't know a word of Russian, and I found that was really a bad scene. So the last time I went, I studied a little Russian, and I'm still trying to keep up with it. And, you know, it occurred to me driving out here what the translation into Russian is of Hardlaver Creek. It's Gulag. So this is... So now we have the Gulag Observatory, and I'm sure that the graduate students who are expected to work all day, be teaching assistants, research assistants, come out here, work all night, go back and work all the next day, will do that exactly the proper. Well, another loose end is that I got to wondering why I got invited out here and realized that after you get old enough, you're assumed to be wise. And you know, the definition of wisdom, I think, is a proper one. Wisdom is what remains after you've forgotten everything you ever learned. And it's very accurate, because I've forgotten so much that I've got to be wise, if nothing else. And years do go by, but a sense of deja vu comes in circumstances like this, because I've actually been responsible for more than one observatory. Back in the Yale days, we also had a problem of an in-town observatory that was completely surrounded by the city and just wasn't going to be able to go anywhere. So, in effect, I had the job of setting up an out-of-town observatory in circumstances very much like this, in the deep forest, dogwood trees, you know, wonderful. So it really brings that back to me, those wonderful years of building a modest observatory, which nevertheless could then and still does to make some work in spite of what back east are far worse conditions than you have in this part of the world. But the general ambience reminded me of a couple of things. And one other definition of getting old, I'm sure some of you have heard this, but it's very true, you get into your anecdotage. And when you get old enough, you get the right to tell stories. So I think I'm old enough to tell a couple of stories. Let me tell you a couple that these circumstances bring to mind. And the first one was back even before we built our out-of-town observatory at Yale. I was working on one beautiful autumn afternoon, very much weather like this, strong wind blowing, and all alone in the observatory, and the phone went ring, 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 so I picked it up. There was a very cultured lady's voice on the other end of the line. She said something like, "Oh, dear me, there's something very, very wrong with the sun. Please, please tell me what it is." And she was really agitated. So I said, "Please, I'll go out and see." And I went out, and the sun looked perfectly normal to me. But then I watched it for a minute, and by golly, she was right. It was the fall. The milkweed pods were breaking. I don't know if you have that around here, but milkweed, you know, spreads its seeds by beautiful tendrils of gossamer, and there was a lot of that blowing in the air, and as we go past the sun would give off sparks and glints as these things would flash by the sun. I've never seen that before or since, but the effect was beautiful. So I went back to the phone and said, "Oh, it is lovely, isn't it? It's just milkweed seeds." And at the other end of the line, there was a silence for a moment, and then, "Oh," and the phone got hung up. Oh, now, wait a minute. Now, that's the beginning of the story. I told you of anecdotage. Come on, relax. So anyway, it was a few months later, I was working again alone in the observatory. In those days, there were only 4 astronomers at Yale, and I was the only one who worked day and night, almost. But anyway, being the youngest one, of course. So the phone rang again, and by golly, a familiar voice. "I wonder, there's a brilliant object in the east. Could you tell me what it is?" And I knew, of course, that was the planet Jupiter, and explained briefly what it was. And then came the reply. "Oh, thank you, young man. You know, you wouldn't believe strange things people try to do. Why, I called the observatory a few months ago with a problem, and some young idiot tried to tell me the sun was shooting out milkweed seeds." It's a true story. Oh my. Well, maybe one more anecdote and I'll stop that nonsense. But also when we were trying to had the idea we'd have to move the observatory, and this is one that Dick Miller and the other astronomers here will really appreciate. We got a phone call at the observatory. Must have been around 1959, I think. The National Science Foundation just getting started. And believe it or not, it was, I guess early summer. The phone call came in, and it was from the National Science Foundation, and the director, Dirk Bauer, was out, so I picked up the phone and answered it. And they said, and I mean, this is a true story, they said, "We have a lot of money left over this year, and we're looking for something to do with it. Would you write us a letter and suggest how you would like to help us spend some of this money?" So I went to the director, and we got instantly, you know, with one simple letter, the money to build the Yale out-of-town Bethany Station, very much like this. I mean, well, will it ever come again? Okay, enough of that. More seriously, why have astronomy at a university? I think Dr. Palms has already given you a few of the suggested reasons why this makes some sense, but I've had occasion, as some of you have, to think about this off and on over the years, and it's really a 4-legged stool, why you should have astronomy at a major university, liberal arts college, something a bit different. But fundamentally, there's not just illiteracy in our world, in the United States especially, there is innumeracy, and that's a very real and very serious problem. I've had college students come recently, just a couple weeks ago, one in my giant undergraduate astronomy class, who honestly cannot do mathematics at the level that I had in 4th grade. Long division, fractions are alien to that college student who's a sophomore or junior. Now, I admit that's fairly extreme, but I mean, how did they get that far? Any of you involved in the system know that there's a real problem. And exactly, it's as President Palm said, that one of the major things we need to do is to somehow get this United States, which has a lot going for it, and some things not going for it so well, a bit more stirred up about what science, mathematics, and similar things can do. And honestly, I don't know a better vehicle than astronomy that really does exactly all the things that you heard about 10 minutes ago, and perhaps even more. So anyway, reaching the vast college audience of students who need to get some science, and one of the great wisdoms in our American educational system really is to force some of that degree of broadening among students who otherwise wouldn't get it. Okay, that's number one. General education, and the more the merrier on that. And I'm delighted to hear that you serve thousands of students a year here. That's exactly the way it ought to be. In fact, most astronomers are missionaries, and I've often had the dream that nobody should be allowed to get through college without at least a one-semester course in astronomy. And where it is taught seriously, where the presidents and deans will take it seriously enough to allow astronomy departments to get large enough to do that, the students flock to it. And nationwide, at the schools where astronomy really is allowed to be taught, and I say allowed, you know, the deans will often say, nah, that next position I'm going to give to physics, or whatever it may be. Physics, or whatever it may be. Anyway, you find that about a third of all the students going through the universities who have the opportunity to will in fact take astronomy. And that's not bad. It could even be more, but okay, number one. Number two, of course, for major universities like Georgia State, is to train the future and to find that occasional outstanding student who will make someday a fine astronomer or related field. So obviously that's another leg of the stool, the graduate student program, very important, and you need facilities to do that. And then there's research, and research universities like this, and 100 or 200 more around the country, really do need to have facilities for their people to do research and to encourage the kind of faculty to come and give them something to work with. That's the third leg of the stool. Then the fourth leg has also been touched on earlier, also I think a bit in Dr. Sedan's talk, that there's a public out there in addition to the public that goes to the university, and that's even bigger yet. And oh, do they need it, and oh, do they thrive on it. When they have the chance to visit an observatory, and for children especially, 8, 10, 12, to look through a telescope and really see the rings of Saturn, the craters of the moon, it's often a lifetime experience. And it goes a long way to help the image of the university, to help the support of science around the country, and just kind of a general improvement of the level of culture of the country scientifically. So at any rate, those are the four legs, and it's clear you have all four of them going here, and as time goes on, I'm sure you're going to find ways to improve each and every one of them beyond the excellent state they already reached. Okay, now that was kind of one question, why astronomy at a university? I think there's some awfully good reasons. Another question, why build a small observatory at a university? Well, a lot of places ask that question and come out with the answer they shouldn't do it. But I think personally you've done exactly the right thing here. And again, there's a sort of a swatch of reasons that support that. They're related to what we talked about earlier. For the best undergraduates, well, for all of them, maybe you can even find a way to get truckloads of buses coming out here. Maybe not on our giant classes. We just have given up trying to get them to out-of-town observatories. Too big a hassle. But your better ones, you can get them out to a place like this and really do a job of firing them up. And also, for the graduate students, it's a great thing to have your own in-house observatory. It doesn't have to have big telescopes, but you got to get them, get their eyes wet on learning how to use telescopes really seriously. Then when they go to the big national observatories, they're up to speed and don't disgrace you. They make good use of the equipment. And, and beyond that, training them not just in technique, but in instrumentation, how CCDs really work, and how to do research. You can learn an awful lot of that in a modest telescope. And then, if you have your own in-house observatory, you can design and build your own instruments and check them out before you, again, go and embarrass yourself at the national observatories by the equipment you take, and you have 4 nights on the 4-meter and it doesn't work. So, within some reasonable limits, you can do that kind of thing at a modest observatory. And then, it is surprising how much research you can do with modest telescopes. There's a syndrome, and again, pardon me if I seem to jump on physics because we love our physicist friends, but there is the tradition that's sort of developed in the physics community that if you want to get a bigger accelerator, the only thing you can do and should do is shut down all the little ones. Now, that may have been forced on the physics community, but to some extent there's a difference. In physics, you're looking at a very small suite of things. In fact, you're trying to find the Higgs particle, so you spend $6 or $7 billion on one machine to look for one particle, more or less. And the astronomy is a very different field, and I often have a hard time trying to explain this to congressmen and to university officials and so on. Astronomy has one rather minor thing to work on. It's called a universe. And there are more things in that universe than you can conceive of. There are stars. There are millions of stars, literally, accessible to a 16-inch telescope. And, maybe not everyone's interesting, but a non-trivial fraction of them are of some interest. And you're not going to get the Keck 10-meter telescope to work on some more or less random bright star you'd like to know more about. The world very, very much needs small telescopes to work on intermediate faintness objects or even fairly bright objects. And there are lifetimes of research to be done, and some of that research turns out to be some of the best research done anywhere. There was a brief allusion in one of the earlier speakers to Helmut Abt, who has been one of the really distinguished astronomers at the Kitt Beach National Observatory for about 25 years.
And he published a paper 6 or 8 years ago that some of the big telescope astronomers still kind of gag at, but it's true. He did a cost-benefit analysis. And the question he asked was this: take the cost of building and operating telescopes of various sizes, and then look at the number of referenced papers in the literature that depend on work from that telescope. And he found the littlest telescopes at Kitt Peak were about 4 times as cost-effective as the giant ones. Now, you know, nobody draws the conclusion you shouldn't build giant telescopes, but the point is, there is an amazingly strong move creeping up even in the astronomy community. Oh, come on, let's shut down those little telescopes and let's concentrate all our efforts on building 1 or 2 big ones. That is the wrong way to go. National observatories are going to have to try to get money to build monster telescopes to work on the frontier. They've got to do it. But I think it'd be a catastrophe if they shut down all their small telescopes, and if they do, I hope you all and institutions like you all can grab them and put them back to work exactly as you're doing with this splendid 16-inch telescope. So anyway, now that's answering the question, why build a small observatory or a modest observatory? These are some of the answers to it. And there's maybe one more, and that again is bringing the public. And I hope and trust that you will be able to work out programs so that over the years, instead of maybe 1,000 people a year, you get 10,000 people a year, 20,000. I mean, you've got a tremendous resource in this Atlanta area. Our McDonald Observatory is in probably the most remote part of the United States, as one graduate student said. You know, it's thousands of miles from anywhere, and that's almost true. The nearest community we have is Fort Davis. One more anecdote. When I first moved to Texas in 1963, I figured I'd better find out what was going on, so I bought the guidebook to Texas. And among other things, it gives a description of each of the 254 counties of Texas. So I immediately flipped to Jeff Davis County, where the observatory, McDonald Observatory, is. And I read the following. And this is a direct quote. McDonald Observatory, no, Jeff Davis County, came to the observatory later. Jeff Davis County is one of the bigger counties in Texas, somewhat larger than the state of Connecticut, but is sparsely populated, containing only 2 large cities. Direct quote, 2 large cities. Fort Davis, population 700, Valentine, population 140. So, anyway, the reason I brought that anecdote in is to say that the observatory is in a very remote part of the world. It's awful far from anywhere. And yet, we get over 100,000 visitors a year, tourists coming to McDonald Observatory. And we give them an excellent little visitor center and a chance to see things. Now, you're not going to set up on that scale here, but I think insofar as you do find, as the years go by, ways of getting more people from Atlanta out here experiencing the observatory, the university will benefit, science will benefit, and even the observatory will benefit. And the last thing is, you get these nondescript crowds of people, you know, old doddering people, and by golly, 3 years later, there's a will that leaves some money to the observatory, or there's a legislator who didn't identify himself, or what have you. So don't knock that. This last reason for having and utilizing an observatory is a very serious one. It takes some people, it takes some money, it takes some support to do it. And your astronomers are tremendously busy here. They can't do much more than they are. But anyway, these are things to bear in mind for the future of this observatory. So, let's see, where are we? I wanted to say one more thing about large versus small telescopes. And this is something that the physicists and the astronomers in the crowd appreciate, but the rest of you may be a little bit not quite aware of. Why do you want a telescope? Most people think that a telescope's job is just to sort of magnify things. But really, the job of a telescope is primarily to gather light, and then, if you're clever enough, in effect, you magnify things the way how McAllister and company are doing. It's another story. But here's the deal. To first order, you build a telescope of a certain size. You say, gee, I'd like to have a bigger one so it can do fancier work. All right, so talk about the diameter of hard rock, you know, gulag, I guess. Anyway, it'll make me forget where I was. The story is that think of the diameter, the size of the mirror, the lens, or whatever you're collecting the light with, as the aperture of the telescope. Okay? The resolving power, the ability to magnify to first order, forgetting minor things like the atmosphere, goes with the aperture. So you build yourself twice as big a telescope, and you have twice as much resolving power as you had before. And that's nice. So you say, why not do it? Then the light gathering power, which is really what most people build telescopes for now. You gather light in order to analyze it, and that's the real heart of most of modern astronomy. Okay, there you gain double, length and width, so you gain with the square of the aperture. And now you say, boy, I'm really making progress. So clearly the little bitty telescope I have, I'm going to build one twice as big, or even 10 times as big, because then I'll get 10 times 10, 100 times the light gathering power, and I'm really in business. And that's the way we all tend to think until we then scratch our heads and say, uh-oh. The cost of the telescope goes up with the length and the width and the height, the cube of the aperture to a good first order. So building a telescope twice the size of the one you now have doesn't cost 2 times as much, or 4 times as much. The first order costs 8 times as much. You want to build a telescope 10 times bigger than you have now. That's 16-inch, you like 160-inch? No problem. 16-inch there, $50,000. Well, let's see, why don't we just scale it up a factor of 10. 10 times 10 times 10, that's nearly 1,000 times as expensive. And now you're into hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, getting close to that. The Keck telescope, the biggest one in the world being built now, is going to be, latest figure, 103 million, and it's still climbing. So anyway, that's the problem. It's actually the 2.7 power if you want to get fussy on the average, but it's pretty close to the cube. And now, what's the point of all that? The point of all that little sermonette was to say, please don't knock small telescopes. I've already said it from one point of view, now I'm saying it from another point of view. In fact, I've said it from 2 or 3 points of view. Small telescopes are tremendously cost-effective for that kind of reason also. And I think almost everyone would agree that by far the most effective space telescope that's ever been flown so far is a little bitty thing called IUE, International Ultraviolet Explorer. And it's got a 12-inch mirror in it. And that thing has produced fantastic astronomy for 12 years. And it's still going right on, producing fantastic astronomy. So small can be beautiful is the big chunk of the message I'm trying to give. Well, let's see. I think as we kind of begin to approach a wrap-up here, the point is that there's one more thing that's vital about a telescope. It gathers light. But the most important thing you can do with the light is do something useful with it. And that in turn depends on the instrumentation you put at the hind end to receive and analyze work with the light. And even more important, it's the brains that you put on top of all that to decide where to point the telescope, how to use the instrumentation, in particular how to make sense out of the data. And what I've known from a distance, and what I've been even more delighted to find in this short visit, is the amount of brain power you managed to collect here in the astronomy program. It is really impressive. Most of you have probably had very little opportunity to hear about the kinds of astronomy that are going on here, and I haven't heard it all myself. And I'm sure that if I try to mention very much, I'll leave out some things by inevitable invidious distinctions of time and knowledge. But there are maybe at least 3 that should be mentioned right now as things that have developed here over the years that each in their class are extraordinarily outstanding kinds of developments. And in particular, there's a field called interferometry. Now, we're talking here, getting back to the concept of building a telescope that in effect has higher magnifying power. The trouble is when you try to do that from the ground, the atmosphere is always whee-hawing the light waves that come in, and they prevent you from using a telescope very efficiently to get real resolving power, to see the sharp detail that you'd like to see in the sky. Well, there is a way to sneak around that problem to a considerable degree, and that's in effect to take your single mirror and break it up into several mirrors and separate them farther and farther apart. When you do that cleverly enough and hook them up in the right way, you can fool the sky into thinking you've got a telescope which is as big as the separation between the mirrors, which you can make hundreds of feet, thousands of feet in principle. And you can make the sky think that you've got a telescope hundreds or thousands of feet in diameter when you do this job right. And then you can get, as we say, resolving power, resolution, sharp pictures of things on the sky to a level that, when I was a grad student, one would have thought was just ridiculous ever to conceive of. Well, it so happens to be true that right here at Georgia Tech, you have what many people would consider to be the world leader, certainly one of the world leaders in that field, Al McAllister, one who's developed this for the past 12 or 15 years in various ways, and has an idea for a telescope that I certainly hope and trust will be funded in the near future that will be the best thing in the world for that. There will be one that will probably beat it because it'll have approximately $250 million rather than $10 million spent on it. That'll be the one the Europeans are building in Chile. But I mean, for $250 million, you can improve things a little bit. But it's not going to do an awful lot more than HAL stuff, I'll bet. So anyway, the point is that you really have something going here in interferometry. And I want to come back to that point at the very end. You've got people also who are extraordinarily ingenious in designing new kinds, really original kinds of telescopes. And we've heard rumors, and I had a vague idea of how something was going along here, this multiple telescope. But I must say, in a couple of hours discussion this morning, I've become a convert to that as one of the brightest ideas that's hit astronomy in many, many years. I think it cannot fail to work. It's going to show a way of building effectively gigantic telescopes for astonishing little money and very versatile systems. And then you've got another kind of activity beavering down the pike here for a good many years. One that's very near to my heart, because the most exciting thing I ever stumbled on in astronomy was the fact that these so-called quasars, or quasi-stellar objects, which are far and away the most distant things we can see in the universe, and therefore, in order to be able to see them billions of light years away, they have to be fantastically, indescribably, inconceivably bright. And what used to be believed that this brightness therefore required these things to be super gigantic galaxies, instead, actually, these are tiny objects, just about the size of big, very large stars, probably, if they're centered. And I was lucky enough to stumble on that phenomenon back in 1963, and pursued it for a few years until I became too much of a bureaucrat and administrator. But Dick Miller here and colleagues and students have been pursuing that line of work and doing it with some extraordinarily imaginative and effective, as well as patient and hard-working approaches, and trying to understand what the engines are at the center of the quasars and the active galaxies that make these things put out more light than the English language has words to describe, more energy. They're amazing. So at any rate, those are just a few of the kinds of absolute frontier work that are going on here already in this rapidly thriving, growing, improving institution. So you've got the wherewithal and you've got the brains to make this stuff click. Now, sort of wrap up words though, really this is a good site. You're going to get an awful lot done with it, but it's not a perfect site. And indeed, the history of astronomy has been for astronomers to try to find better places to put their telescopes. Like what? Well, in the old days, hundreds of years ago, there was a title to this talk, which I forgot about before coming here, but observatories passed, all right? So I got to say something about that agrees with what you came expecting to hear. Observatories passed. They were built with the notion that, convenience was the only important thing. So the telescope was in the astronomer's backyard, literally, essentially everywhere. And it's amazing how that tradition lasts. Europeans are really traditional people. And when they build observatories, right up until very recently, by golly, they would build the observatory sort of right outside the town, and the first thing they do is build a director's house, and the director's house would have one of the telescopes on the roof of the house. And, it's amazing how long that lasted. Well, anyway, astronomers in this country soon realized that wasn't the best way to go, and began to move the telescopes first out of town, and then to high mountains, and then to very remote high mountains, and conditions kept getting better and better. And now we're occupying some of the remotest and highest mountains in the world, and the observing gets better and better all the time. And clearly you're not on one of the most remote and high mountains in the world here, so that will be a fundamental limitation to the Dulong Observatory. But still, it's not a very serious one in terms of the type of telescopes and the type of work that you're doing here. But now, let's follow that theme just a notch farther. Where's the best place on Earth to build an observatory? Well, it happens to be a place where nobody's got one yet. It's in northern Chile. The present observatories are in what I think of as the rainforest of Chile now, because there are a few sprigs of grass and a few cactus plants around. It actually rains there occasionally. If you go 1,000 miles farther north, near the city of Antofagasta and back in, you have an area that's totally dry, absolutely arid. It's like the face of the moon or the face of Mars. And there are mountains rising over 20,000 feet. Some of them had good roads going up nearly to the summit. There's one mountain, Alcanquilcha, where the excellent road goes up to 20,000 feet, highest road in the world. You'll say nobody can live there. There are 4 men who live there all year round. And they go down to 14,000 feet to a village to play soccer over Saturday. And the point is, there are places like that that are even better than any place we have in the Earth so far developed. And one of my dreams before I become absolutely senile is to see what we can do maybe to get a little observatory or even a big one up there. May never happen. It's a dream. Anyhow, is there a better place? Oh yes, there's a better place. It's up there somewhere. But anyway, a little bit later in the afternoon, you'll see the moon. It should be right about there, but I just can't quite pick it up. It's probably in the top of that tree. Anyhow, what about the moon? Well, the moon is the best place in very likely the solar system, maybe not quite the universe, but there's even a reason why it may be the best place in the universe to build observatories. And how come? Well, when you want to think of where you'd like to put an observatory, you want to get rid of all that air. You know, the air is wonderful to breathe. It really smells good out here today, but it's bad news for astronomy. It's nothing but bad news. The less air you can have around, the better off you are for every kind of astronomy you can imagine. And none at all is the best. So the moon is virtually a perfect vacuum. Secondly, you'd like to have something to lean on when you want your telescope to go somewhere. And one of the reasons why the Hubble Space Telescope, when it flies next week, if it finally gets up after 30 years of effort on some of our parts, when it finally flies, it will cost about $2 billion, the most expensive scientific instrument ever built. Why? One of the reasons, there are a number of reasons, but one of them is that we get this monster thing. It's about as long as this tent is wide, a little less than that. Huge thing. And it's floating in space. And now you'd like to move it from here to here to point to something else. How are you going to do it? And it weighs tons and tons of mass up there. I mean, it doesn't weigh, it's weightless, but the inertia has got to be handled. Well, they have to control that by gyros that spin, you know, and the counter actually moves the telescope, and got to unspin, and they got to lock it down to an accuracy that's sort of like looking at a dime in Washington from here, you know, the angle from one side of the dime to another to get it stabilized. Man, alive, is that a difficult job. They think they've got it solved, but it's one of the reasons why this telescope is incredibly expensive. But on the moon, shucks, you've got only 1/6 the gravity you have on the Earth and no wind. Very few people realize that one of the main reasons why giant telescopes on Earth are so expensive to build is because the wind blows. And yet it's got to be perfectly stable against wind. Does that ever take engineering design, steel? Oh, terrible. So anyway, on the moon you got no wind and much lighter gravity. You build the flimsiest looking little things and they hold the telescope just beautifully. So those are some of the reasons. Another reason is you got landscape galore. The moon's a big place, you know, it's a quarter the size of the Earth. There are craters on the moon that are a good fraction the size of Texas, and I didn't think there was anything bigger than Texas in this world, but you have room galore to lay out stuff. I could go on. I've written some papers on this because this is getting to be more and more the theme of my life, trying to encourage people to work toward telescopes on the moon. And I've got a list of about 30 virtues the moon has that are just absolutely outstanding for astronomy. But now, all of this does have a relevance and a punchline. You've been patient. Let's come to it. Here it is. Why really, or what is the ultimate nirvana, let me put it that way, the nirvana for astronomers for telescopes on the moon? Well, the answer is that now we're back to, in effect, magnifying power, the ability to see things sharp and clear. We've kind of given up on the Earth, you know, except for a few visionaries like Hal here, because that atmosphere just mucks things up so badly. But once we get to the moon and really can build serious big interferometers, not the $10 million toys that I was thinking of here, then we're in business. Why? Because there you can imagine building interferometers of 10 or 100 miles in extent. Optical interferometers, you know, not tomorrow, but 50, 70 years from now. And those interferometers will be able, when all the problems are solved, a few trivial things to do between now and then, when the problems are solved, it'll be possible to generate real imagery of things in space down at what we call the micro-arcsecond level. Now, what does that mean? Well, all of you know that you divide a circle into 360 degrees, or an angle has 90 degrees, you divide each of those into 60 minutes, and then each minute into 60 seconds. So a second of arc is a pretty small angle. A micro-arcsecond is a millionth of that. Okay, suppose you build yourself an interferometer that has micro-arcsecond resolution. I've spent several years off and on airplanes and whatnot trying to think of ways to make clear what that means. For instance, here's what it means in reasonably visualizable terms. Suppose you took some water out of the pond down here and wanted to look to see what kind of little bugs it had in it, critters, paramecia, algae, and so on. You'd get a microscope, right? And you'd look in that pond water and see what you had. If you had one of these interferometers out, say in Anchorage, Alaska, and we're looking back here at Atlanta, and if there weren't for the curvature of the Earth and a few minor problems like that, you could study to about the same resolution these little buglets in the water here from Anchorage, Alaska, as you could do with a microscope right here on this table. I mean, that is magnifying power. You believe me? Or let's try another one. Suppose you built one of these things on the moon, and you looked at the Earth, and somebody had a newspaper here. The moon's 250,000 miles away. You could open that newspaper, and with this interferometer on the moon, you could not only read the newspaper, you could study the fine structure of every printed letter. It would be like looking through a low-powered microscope, essentially, at the letters. From the moon, 250,000 miles away. Now that is magnifying power, and that's what we can and will get on the moon one of these days. Or to translate it into astronomical terms, the nearest stars are 4, 5, 6 light years away. That's, again, farther than there are any words in any language to give any feeling for how far away. It's just, oh, so far. And yet, again, with interferometers of this kind, in principle, one would be able not only to see Earth-like planets around those stars, but even to resolve continents on the surface of planets around those stars. Now, again, there are a few minor difficulties of detail to make all this happen. But the point is, in principle, it's there, and things that are there in principle usually, in the end, come around in practice. And what I'm saying is that the work that Hal and his colleagues are doing here as students is leading directly into that stream, and I'll be dead before it happens, but Hal won't be, and I'm willing to predict that he and his colleagues, his students, are going to be building things like this on the moon, the ultimate nirvana instruments for astronomy, and it's going to happen. So the last words I'd like to say, though, are that even when that happens, 40, 50 years from now, I bet you this observatory is still here and still doing most of the things that I said earlier are the virtues of an observatory like this. And I'll bet you one last thing, that Georgia State University will never regret building this place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those wonderful remarks, Harlan. I hope we can live up to them. I did neglect earlier to mention one group that contributed very significantly to the development of this observatory, and that was the Department of Natural Resources, which provided us with this wonderful site. I certainly want to recognize their participation in this, and in particular I would like to thank Bruce Roper, who's the superintendent of the park here, who has worked with us so much in helping us with the logistics of many of the aspects associated with this observatory. I want to thank all of you for coming and attending this dedication. In a few moments, some refreshments will be available in the rear of the tent at the tables. I invite you to come and tour the facility behind us, to spend whatever time you have available to visit that facility. For those of you who can stay, there is a picnic that we will be having at approximately 5:30, which will be at the pavilion over at the park. And there will be an open house for public viewing this evening a bit later when it gets dark. Again, thank you very much for coming.